The evening sun slid slowly behind the city skyline as the single dad named Mark walked out of the small diner where he worked double shifts to keep food on the table for his little boy. He was tired, worn out, and quiet. His apron still smelled like fried onions and coffee stains, yet his heart beat heavy with thoughts of bills and long nights and the empty chair at the table where his wife once sat. He had lost her 2 years ago in an accident, and since then every day had been a struggle. But he kept going for his son Jacob, who waited for him in their tiny apartment, with drawings taped on the wall and hope shining through the cracks of hardship. After closing up the diner, Mark often saw the same girl waiting outside in her wheelchair. Her clothes were worn, and her eyes carried the quiet kind of sadness that only people who had seen too much too young could wear. She waited until the lights inside dimmed, and then softly knocked on the back door, asking if there were any leftovers. The cook sometimes gave her soup or bread, whatever was left. But tonight when she came, Mark felt something tug inside him. He packed up a small box of food, wrapped it neatly, and handed it to her. But as she wheeled away, he found himself wondering who she was and where she went. He had seen her before, always alone, always polite, never asking for money, only food. She never ate there. She took it somewhere else. That curiosity mixed with a father's instinct made him follow her from a distance. Her wheelchair wheels squeaked softly along the sidewalk. She moved slowly under flickering streetlights, and the wind tugged at her hair. She turned down a narrow alley between two buildings and stopped near a broken fence. Mark stayed back his. Footsteps light his heart uneasy. She lifted a loose board from the fence and pushed herself through. He hesitated, then followed on the other side. Was an empty lot filled with weeds, broken toys, and rusted swings. The kind of forgotten place where time stopped. The girl stopped near an old shed and softly called out a name. The door creaked open and 2 small children peeked out their faces, thin and tired. She smiled and handed them the box of food, her voice gentle, telling them to eat slowly and save some for later. Mark stood frozen watching as the children hugged her and she stroked their hair as if she were their mother. He realized she must have been barely 16 herself, but she had this deep, steady kindness that cut through. The cold, he could not understand why someone like her was living this way or where their parents were. As he watched, she spoke softly about dreams of having a small home, about school, about walking again one day. Mark felt tears welling up because he knew that feeling of wanting more for someone else than for yourself. He turned to leave quietly, but stepped on a can, and the sound made her spin around, her eyes wide in the half-light. She looked afraid, but he raised his hands gently to show he meant no harm. He introduced himself. Softly, said he worked at the diner and had just wanted to make sure she was safe. She hesitated and then nodded, her eyes wary but grateful. She told him her name was Lily and that she was fine. Really fine. Though her trembling voice said otherwise, Mark walked home that night with his heart heavy and his thoughts spinning, not knowing that following her would change both their lives forever. The next morning, Mark woke early before the city had even begun to stir, the light outside gray and uncertain. Like his thoughts, he kept seeing the girl in the wheelchair and the 2 children huddled by the shed. He thought of the way she smiled, despite her tired eyes, and how she gave away food. She clearly needed herself at breakfast. Jacob asked why his dad looked so sad, and Mark smiled weakly, saying nothing, but his heart was loud with worry. After dropping Jacob off at school, he went back to the diner. His mind distracted, his hands moving through, habit pouring coffee cleaning tables, but all he could think about was Lily and those little ones. At closing time, he packed an extra bag of food without telling anyone, and when the sky turned soft with the first stars, he walked toward the alley. Again, his steps slower this time, as if the city itself held its breath. Waiting when he reached the fence, the same soft voice called out from inside, and he saw Lily again. This time, she looked surprised but not scared. When she saw him, she said, "You came back," and he nodded. handing her the bag, saying there was plenty more where that came from. She smiled shyly and thanked him before calling the two children out again. They ran to her, clinging to her wheelchair, and she passed them the food. With gentle hands, Mark watched silently, noticing how careful she was. How she ate last only after the children were full and laughing. For the first time he saw them laugh, their laughter soft and pure. Cutting through the cold air, he sat down on a rock nearby and asked where their parents were. Lily hesitated for a long time, then spoke quietly. She said the children were her little brother and sister. Their mother had died when she was 11, and their father had left soon after, when her accident happened. She had no one else, so she took care of them the best she could. She said they had stayed in shelters before, but sometimes it was safer out here because at least they were together. Mark listened, unable to speak, his chest tight. With the kind of pain that comes from recognition he saw in her story, pieces of his own life, the loss, the loneliness, the stubborn love that refuses to give up. He told her about Jacob and how hard it had been since his wife passed away. And for a long time, they just sat there, two strangers connected by sorrow and the small, fragile hope that maybe kindness still mattered before he left. He promised to bring more food the next night, but as he turned to go, Lily called out asking why he cared. And he paused, looking back, and said, "Because someone once cared for me when I had nothing left." She nodded, her eyes shiny with something like belief. The following nights became a quiet ritual after work. Mark would bring meals, blankets sometimes, old books for the children, and each time he learned more about them, their names were Emily and Noah, and they called him Mr. Mark. With the innocent trust only children can give, Lily never asked for money, only things they could use. She still refused help for herself, saying she would manage one way or another, but Mark could see how pale she was growing, how thin she had become one night. Rain fell hard, and when he reached the shed, the roof leaked and the children were shivering. He could not stand it any longer. He told Lily she and the kids needed to come stay at his place. At least for a while. She refused at first, pride flashing in her eyes, but when a thunderclap shook the sky and Emily began to cry, she finally nodded silently and let him push her wheelchair through the wet streets toward his small apartment. When they reached the apartment, the rain had softened to a mist, and the streetlights shone like pale moons through the fog. Mark helped Lily through the doorway. While Jacob ran to bring towels and warm clothes, the little boy stared wide-eyed at the newcomers. But when he saw Emily and Noah shivering, he smiled shyly and offered them his favorite blanket. Lily tried to refuse, but Mark insisted, saying everyone deserved a dry place to rest that night. The apartment felt different, fuller, warmer, alive with quiet voices and the rustle of shared comfort. While the rain whispered against the windows, Lily sat in her wheelchair watching as the children ate at the small table, their faces glowing in the yellow light. She whispered thank you, and Mark just nodded, unable to find words for the ache and peace tangled inside him. The next days fell into a rhythm. Mark went to work early, leaving breakfast ready, while Lily looked after the children, helping Jacob with homework and teaching Emily to read from old library books she had kept in a worn backpack. The wheelchair made it hard to move around, but she never complained, and the children laughed again, in ways that made the small apartment feel almost like home. Mark began to notice things he had not seen in a long time: the way sunlight hit the window, the sound of laughter filling spaces that had been silent since his wife passed away. But he also saw how Lily tried to hide her pain, her hands trembling when she thought no one was looking. One evening he came home to find her staring out the window, tears running silently down her cheeks. She said she felt guilty for taking his kindness. When she had nothing to give in return, Mark told her she had already given him something far greater than anything else. She had reminded him what it meant to care. Again the words hung between them, heavy with truth, and the room felt still, like the moment before dawn. Time passed, and soon social workers became involved after a neighbor told them about the family living together. Mark feared they would take the children. But when the truth came out about Lily's guardianship and how she had cared for her siblings against all odds, they were moved to tears. They arranged medical help for Lily and proper housing for them all. Mark offered to become their sponsor, helping them transition into a stable life. Lily resisted, at first still. Proud, still unsure how to trust the world, but his steady kindness wore through her fear like light through thin cloth. Weeks later, she began therapy at a rehabilitation center, and slowly she regained some movement in her legs, not much but enough. To give her hope, she often said that hope was something she had forgotten. Existed until the night Mark followed her through the alley 1 year later. On a bright spring morning, Mark stood outside the diner again this time, holding Jacob's hand, while Lily rolled up beside him with Emily.